Nothing.
I'm going to start the recording while we wait a little. I guess, do you think we're at sufficient quorum?
Um, Probably not to make any decisions, but like.
I think we're maybe about what we're going to get.
I think Bugs is coming, and I think Josh is coming.
Josh said they're traveling. I don't think they're able to make
Oh, I thought they were traveling to be able to come to the. Never mind.
No, I think they're traveling. Let's do this. Let's start going through things, and if more people show, that's fine.
Yes. Just a quick recap from last week's action items. We have some reports that we need to do.
Hold on, before we go, so for those of you from the cargo team, usually we start with some light triage, which probably will be boring for you.
Oh yes, we should.
And then we'll get to the standard aware cargo.
Should we switch the order of things?
We could do that. That would work for me if we want to start with discussing standard aware cargo and then switch back. I don't know. Let's try that. All right.
Seems like
we're going to put a firm time limit in order to ensure we actually get to the...
Yeah, I was going to say, let's try for 30 minutes and then we'll see where we are. But maybe one of you would like to talk about the RFC. Is that possible? I don't know how many people. I read it, but it was a while ago.
Yeah, me as well. Maybe Alex.
I can also give a very dated summary at this point. Eric, I think you're reading it very recently, though. You probably have the most up-to-date in that case, but if you don't want to give a summary, I can certainly try.
Go ahead.
All right. So this RFC is quite old at this point, and I believe pretty dated to the point that a lot of things have changed, just the general background and kind of where it wants to go. From what I understand, the very high-level motivation is it kind of sucks that cargo doesn't really understand that every crate in the world depends on std or core, or whatever set of sister crates we currently have, things like proc macro as well. And so this is particularly problematic in the sense that we cannot recompile the standard library for things like debug assertions, for more debug info, for less debug info, for I want to turn off lib backtrace support, I want to have a completely new architecture but I want to tweak some cogen flags, like I want to enable I'm WebAssembly and I want to enable the atomics feature in the standard library. There's a whole slew of reasons why we want to recompile that. I can go into more details with what exactly is going on there. And so the goal of this RFC is to basically enable that in one form or another. And so it's largely a cargo-related thing as far as I know. I suspect it might touch language stuff as well in terms of crates and sysroots and whatnot. But that's sort of the general thrust, and then the actual details of the RFC I think have changed a lot over time. It's sort of unclear like what's in cargo toml, what exactly is inferred where, when does cargo recompile the standard library, when does it not recompile the standard library. And so I think, at least from my personal opinion, we probably want to keep today's system by default, which is if I type cargo build on Linux, I'm not going to recompile the standard library. I'll just keep using whatever I previously downloaded. But somehow, when something reasonable happens, maybe we do switch to the mode where we're recompiling things.
Because that would presumably, like, if we did that for everyone, it would worsen compile times notably.
Yeah, I think that, so number one, it would be a big compile time hit. It's not huge. The standard library actually compiles pretty quickly. It is noticeable for like Hello World. But I also think it's an issue in terms of just functionality. Sometimes we have like building lib backtrace for standard stuff, like having a C compiler one way or another. We don't typically need that, but users don't always have a fully configured environment that is guaranteed to compile those kinds of things. And so for those use cases, it's often very useful for us to build it ourselves and then ship something that we know works to users for something like that. So that's a much more esoteric than the build time, which is would clearly regress.
And lib backtrace is a point specifically, like the ultimate plan is to remove that, right, and replace it with a Rust only dependency.
It's true. That's probably like in the far future going to happen, but we still have the thing with compiler RT. But again, that's another one where in the long run we want everything written in Rust at that point. But we can certainly say for the time being, and I would guess the next year or so, we're going to have some C code which is either more performant or just has functionality we haven't implemented in Rust yet.
Makes sense. Thanks.
So there's, first of all, I think Taylor, you were saying there was a fair amount of link interaction. Maybe you want to outline some of what you had in mind. But I did have a few other questions too about features and stuff. I'm not sure how up to date this text is. I was looking over my printout. Like, there's some notion of the features, like basically cargo features applied to lib standard, right?
Right.
About in here.
So the idea here is that there's nothing stable initially, and we as a libs team would decide what features are stable, but the idea is this would eventually allow for tweaking the functionality of the standard library one way or the other. So removing binary bloat via a number of mechanisms, switching implementations for whatever reason, things like that.
Okay. And one thing I was wondering about was, like, they showed some, like if I put this on the field, but since you're here to answer my questions, they put some things like this, you know, in the RC, I don't know who the author was, but the one concern I had with this was like, if we take something that used to not require a feature and make it featureable, then that's the breaking change. I don't know if there'd been any thought given to that.
Yeah, so this is a general cargo problem where it's technically a breaking change dealing with any of the features is kind of a breaking change for this exact reason where you could turn off default features. And so this is one where I think this is sort of an end goal where we eventually want to get to a system where we can do this, but we're not going to stabilize this unless we actually are confident we have a non-breaking thing. And so like maybe we just say that you can't turn off the default features of core, or like a feature has no default features, so something like that. And like that's a guarantee we provide. And so this is where like this RFC specifically was proposing a couple of phases where like you can't do this in the first stable phase because we haven't figured it out yet.
It seemed like I would go, like it's a problem in the ecosystem, but it's a huge problem in lib standard. Because we don't have a 2.0 to option.
Right.
I would put it more as like a hard constraint, but it's okay. Like it should be resolved. Some mechanism that is not this.
It seems to me that removing features isn't that problematic because it's most like, from a testing point of view, you simply comment out code. Whereas with switching implementations, then you need to test those implementations and presumably have like specific builders for that, and how can we keep up with the quality in terms of having switching implementations and possibly having like n times m.
Right. And this is something the libs team we haven't barely discussed either for libcore or the standard library. Like we've talked about this platform abstraction layer idea or sort of like something with features there, but nothing ever's gotten concrete to the point that it's an actual proposal that we want to move forward with. And so like another example of why we would not want default features at all is it's basically impossible to turn them off, especially for like libc where everyone depends on it. And literally everyone has to turn off default features. So that's another reason we're like, we have a lot more in terms of features to talk about from the libs team perspective of what exactly do we want to stabilize and how exactly are we going to architect this.
Another point in this RC was to stabilize the, I don't know if it still proposes to stabilize the target specification format, the JSON file thingy.
Yes, and from what I understand, I think I'm speaking. I'm like slightly mixed up because I actually thought this was mostly about the really, really old RCs. This is actually far more recent, but bringing this back into mind, this is from discussions at the all hands. And so this is where I've been mentioning this in the library a lot, but this is also sort of equally applicable to core. And I think the main use case of this RFC is specifically for core and specifically for the embedded ecosystem, where those are the cases that we don't have targets in Rust yet, but LLVM has all the support necessary to generate code for these targets. So, for example, like there's some thumb processor with some subset of features, and we don't have an official name for it. And so the idea is having some sort of way to stabilize that. So I don't have a ton of opinions of the JSON target specification. It's a little crazy to do so. I don't know how we're going to quite stabilize that. It's kind of like a compiler team thing as well. But,
Yeah, the thing I'm wondering about is whether we are like tying ourselves too much to LVM if we consider things like crane lift, and if this has implications for language design as well.
right, and that's like basically one of the number one concerns about these target specifications. But I think it also goes further here in terms of not so much LVM, but just the current day and age of the compiler C, where the target specifications have been changing all the time as we add random options, we remove random options, we just stop interpreting some options. And so it's not so much, for me, it's not so much an LLVM. I mean, well, again, this is the compiler team question, so not related to this library at all. But for me, this is a question of how, like just stabilization in general, as opposed to anything related to LLVM itself, because LLVM actually is pretty well divorced from this in most cases, or some cases where at least there.
Yeah.
But and also to reiterate, this RFC was explicitly written and especially when I talked with him about this, was to propose various phases, and so I think like it gets much more questionable as time goes on in terms of like whether we want to stabilize all of that. But the intention was that there should be some kernel subset which is very useful to everyone, where maybe you don't touch features at all, you don't touch about new targets. All you can do is on the standard library and libcore on the stable channel, you can recompile the standard library, at least with different cogen options. So like panic abort, optimizations, debug info, and then paving forward for these later features like features or things like that.
So one question I have there, which I'm not really sure I understand, is how does this interact with bootstrapping and like nightly and stable?
Right, and so this is where every single compiler is paired with exactly one copy of the standard library that it can compile, and so we can guarantee on stable that it can compile its own stable. And so Cargo will basically just set the Rust bootstrap flag and say, Cargo will do that knowing that it's guaranteed to work because it's the exact source code that Rust knows how to compile. And so every channel is accompanied with its own source code, and so they can all compile its own source code.
So Cargo would like hash the standard library source code and then check whether
Cargo would just assume that whatever is at that location is the right standard library.
Is that in the RFC somewhere?
Well, I should also say that's my own personal opinion. So I don't want to start hashing the standard library and say we can only hash that one code. And so this may not be explicitly specified.
The attack vector that's hypothesized here, somebody edits the Cargo's internal directories. Is that like that's the way you would compile something with Rust Bootstrap?
Well, Firefox already uses Rust Bootstrap, so it's easy to do that if you want to. But
I feel like it's okay for us to just declare that.
Right.
We already probably say you shouldn't do that.
Right. Basically, if you do this, then we don't offer you. You have voided your warranty in terms of guarantee.
To be clear, my question wasn't about the mechanism we use to enforce this invariant that Alex described. I just wanted to know the invariant was in the RFC, and I now see the invariant that you described, that the source code, the one-to-one mapping from the compiler version of the source code, it is actually in the RFC itself. I just want to make sure that was spelled out there.
So I guess this is just a matter of phases, Alex, but I was just thinking about how there's a lot of like lang items and so on that are not in libcore.
I had an idea about that actually. I think some of the lang items could be moved out from core to like a really, really tiny crate that only concerns itself with lang items. So that would require introduction of some new lang items to deal with the coherence, but that might reduce them.
To be clear, the intention here is to not mess with lang items at all. And so, like for example, today I could create an rlib unstable linking against core that's missing lang items. I just can't link that. Like if you try and produce a dynamic library or an executable, you get errors saying like this lang item is defined or whatever. And so the idea is we don't want to touch that at all. Or we can still enable that like on like some of this I think is also empowering the nightly users to do more, where the idea is if this eventually rides a stable train, this is sort of like the fundamental kernel of all nightly users and embedded ecosystems and things like that. And so they might still be doing crazy nightly things where they're touching lang items or doing various aspects, but they're building on this stable baseline of we're recompiling the standard library and then linking things in later. And then otherwise, if you're just recompiling the standard library plus libcore and you link an executable, all the lang items are provided for you and you don't have to touch them at all.
Right. I guess I mostly wanted to ask whether there like had been given a lot of thought or to like
I'm
how this
actually
was going to work or not, but it sounds like not that much. And that's
one thing that I'm actually trying is to in a PR is to have lang items work lazily in hero lowering. It's unclear if that's going to pan out, but I'm working on it.
One example where I think it's maybe not the best story today is that I think with enough support in the embedded ecosystem at this point, if you have a crate with a panic handler and you have libcore compile with panic abort, then you can link executables that only have libcore that don't need the standard library. Oh, and you probably also have to bring an allocator somewhere at some point. But if you compile libcore with panic unwind and you try to create an executable, you just can't do that on stable. And so it's like only in this one compile mode, it's kind of secretive that now you can produce a stable executable. But if you compile it on a different mode, you can't produce an executable on stable. And so I think the idea is there's some lang items which are defined by std, which are primarily the allocator and the panic handler, and there's probably going to be a couple other random ones. But it's kind of like we try to work without it if possible, but it's not really well documented in what situations you work or where you do work without it, or how you have to compile things at that point, if that makes sense.
so that's actually yeah, that's kind of what that's the concern I had, but I didn't know it. I mean, that does mean this maybe more compiler team in some sense, but not really. That like, if we currently don't require I guess I would say I currently consider it sort of a best effort that we try not to require more lang items than necessary, but if it's really inconvenient, we don't try that hard. You're supposed to have them around. And this sounds like it would definitely be a mild stability hazard where it used to work without this lang item and now it doesn't, right? Like
about
things like the strings and stuff.
It would be good to write down like an example where things might go wrong. So you have like.
I mean,
you mean like a case where this happened in the past? You mean central, like?
No, just like an example of just a situation where laziness could become a stability hazard, like a code example or something.
In terms of compiler implementation, it's basically only affects, as far as I know, lang items that are either in alloc or std, just anything above core, because you may not have alloc or std. And so like there is the ability to have an inherent like methods on stir if you link alloc. And so the compiler just has to be ready for like, oh, well, now maybe some crates don't link to alloc, but 99% of crates do. And so there could be like some interesting details in the compiler like that. Other larger examples, though, I mean, the panic handler is probably the biggest one, where it has like random symbol references and/or compiler intrinsics for if you have panic unwind mode, and that's why because core itself has to reference those. Somehow they have to be pulled in. But a lot of this isn't necessarily lang item business, more so like how do we implement this in library, both on the compiler side and the library side.
I was more concerned about things like you don't have a copy tree, which you could do if you can supply your own core.
Oh, okay. So that is like one of the final phases of this RFC where you can like basically edit libcore, edit libstandard, and I like that. As far as I know, will literally always require a nightly compiler, and so I think.
I mean, yeah. Go on.
Is the stable version of this? You will always be compiling the exact source code, and you'll probably literally always require core. I think there's 0 use cases where we want to be stably producing a full Rust program that doesn't have libcore.
Right.
That's basically like the compiler itself.
But another example would be things like F32 runtime or whatever, which is in the standard. But I'm not so concerned. The examples I see at least don't seem that hard for the compiler to deal with them not being there, because it's not like there are no methods. There are no methods. But it's more the core stuff that's the biggest concern. So.
One thing I'm wondering is whether it would be a good idea to split this RFC to like target specification as one thing, and like feature gating, having features for the core and standard library is a different thing. Are those like atomic things we could ship?
In my opinion, I think that's what I recommended as well, but James was more of a fan of putting it all in one and having explicit phases.
We also now have the future work part of an RFC. So there might be a dedicated spot for this is phase one, and there are future phases in a way there wasn't when this RFC was last looked at.
Right. I suppose one could merge the RFC and then split them into different tracking issues after doing that.
I mean, we said we would talk for about 30, and we talked for about 22 minutes. I'm wondering in the last little bit, it feels like there hasn't been a lot of LangTeam, like really core LangTeam concerns here. Is there something we're missing? Anyone think of things like splitting the RFC feels like maybe it's good, maybe it's not, but
it's mostly a question of target features, target specifications, I think, that might impact us. And the lang item bits, perhaps, but other than that, no.
It does sound like the sense that I'm getting is that for now it should be required that if you are unstable, you are linking against libcore, literally all Rust programs for lang items, and that's like a baseline requirement that will always be required.
I've always assumed that was the point of libcore.
Me too.
I had a question about that. There was an RFC, and Aaron had a blog post about how he would like to see sort of core and STD merge and then use features to select exactly which things are enabled. Is that still any desire to have that, or is it like core and STD are always going to be separate?
Right now, the intention is to not block us from that feature, but we're not sort of actively pursuing it because we don't. There's thorny questions that weren't really sure how to resolve.
My concern here is that this would sort of solidify that core as a dependency in cargo, and that would, kind of cement that distinction.
Isn't it possible to have core as a dependency in cargo, but then remove things from the standard? Like it uses STD and doesn't use various things from it, like CFGs it out.
I'm not sure.
Sorry, I'm not sure if we were just talking over each other, but I think that it's already, pretty clearly observable via like the actual linking args and things that you give to Rust C when you compile programs, that there is a distinction between those as crates and as like units of compilation, right?
And this is one of the really thorny questions about how are we actually going to ship a feature like this in terms of and not break anyone, where there's a lot of ideas.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Alex.
There's a lot of ideas about how like maybe core will just re-export all of std, and so the dependency will go the other way, but you just can't really tell. And so like maybe if you depend on core in your cargo atomically, you actually depend on std, but with less features or whatever. It's all sort of magical and hand wavy, and like I'm not personally convinced the future will ever come about, but just for a lot of these weird reasons. But like I don't think that. I would naively say that this is not making it harder to have that feature come available, even though it's always already required.
So today, to give an example of the thing that I was talking about, in no-std programs, we don't pass a linker arg that allows Rust C to find libc. And so if you try and compile something for Fuchsia without that is no-std today, it would fail to compile in this world where we had like merged the crates into one.
presumably you might be able to handle that with like by having these things are in there, but they're CFG'd out kind of because it's nested. But yeah, I don't know. Somehow.
I think like the idea was not to get rid of core or anything like that. It was actually to get rid of STD and make STD a sort of facade for everything underneath.
Right, but we can't have multiple compilations of std, right, in the same program or in the same like linker artifacts. But we need to be able to link some objects without the standard library and without libc and not other objects. Anyway.
Yeah. I mean,
so in terms of who which tools should deal with this, I get the sense that it's mostly Cargo and then also the compiler team.
That seems to be my impression.
Cool. I think the language team can probably remain, but more passively. So we won't like actively work on this, and maybe you can. But maybe we can.
It seems like libs also obviously libs, but yeah. Affects everybody in some way. But
should I add another team?
I don't know. I don't care. Libs team can decide if they want to put themselves on there. I feel like it. I feel happy and glad we had this discussion, but I don't see a lot of.
Yeah, that sounds
part of the point of the discussion is to make sure. But,
yeah.
All right. I think should we switch to triage and let these 4 people go if they choose?
Yeah, I think that sounds good.
All right, y'all. You can stay or not. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So, reviewing back to triage, reviewing last week's action items. So, we are going to, Nico is going to write a report about rebalanced concurrence. That hasn't happened yet. And lifetime vision, we also need to figure out what the rules are and to make sense of this.
But just to be clear, I put this, I would call the rebalancing coherence. I plan to do it, but I don't consider it particularly high priority. So the pin itself, I would rather do sooner.
Yeah, I agree. I'm working on the type areas invariants. I almost have a PR. Need to write the report. I'm going to try to do something about it today. Moving on to, we can jump directly to infiltrate, I guess.
Yeah, we could talk about that. So we've had this on the radar for a long time. I think Boats was going to write some responses, hasn't happened yet. I also have been looking over it, and I feel like I have my own personal take, which is that I would like to see us agree kind of on the overall plan, and I'd like to work out some of the examples a little more. I think we probably do know the overall plan. I just don't feel I have it like all in my head in cache. I actually thought the RFC had a pretty good summary though when I reread it last night. So it seems like there could be grounds for some kind of meeting to talk it over in depth, but that's probably separate from Boats' specific concern, although we could talk about that too.
So
basically I'd like to see this like more, there's an opportunity for us to advertise to everyone, here's all the moving parts around infiltrate, to kind of give the context that we so often fail to give.
I think what we need to do is break up the tracking issue and close the old one and make a new one, and then sort of like have a master tracking issue that links to various places, so we can track it better, like the const FN thing. But I was going to do that after hopefully merging this RFC. But it felt premature before that.
So, Boats, have you had time to look at this? I'm going to assume no.
Yeah, no.
One of the concerns that arose to my mind was this, that at least I hadn't considered. Currently, we support, well, I guess this is the current syntax, which I don't particularly like, but that's okay. Things like this where you have unused type parameters and so on. And I guess this is what that would map to, but it didn't feel like that. Not sure why that made a difference to me, but it wasn't like obviously.
That's true. And that's the same in
it had a strange feeling to me, and I'm trying to put my finger on exactly why. But I thought we should at least include some examples of that kind.
I'm sure Varkor would be happy to add more examples if you ask for it.
Yep, I don't doubt it. I'm mainly trying to decide if I like them. But the thought was then that if I would, yeah, okay.
Okay. So, Bugs, do you have any thoughts about like overall? Now that we are discussing it.
I still want to take time to think about it, and just have not had time because I'm working on Peace in Kuwait, and it takes up all of my time. Sort of.
We could ask this question about prioritization. Do we think where do we put this relative to async Kuwait? Do we want to? I guess one question I have, Boots, is whether you feel like before having any group discussion, you would rather take time to think about it on your own, or whether you'd rather have some group discussion about it to work through it live. Like that's a way to make time, is to schedule it.
Yeah, I would like to think about it on my own. I also feel like maybe like basically we could not block implementing it on Resolve. Like
I don't understand. Not
like
block.
I assume the reason people keep pinging about this is because they want to make implementation changes to the nightly feature, and we could possibly like do that ahead of making a final decision on the syntax.
I think people want to close out the syntax discussion too, but
I think Varkor is concerned about doing a bunch of work without like having a commitment from us, but perhaps someone else would like to implement it, like Alex.
It's not that much. Yeah, it's not that hard to implement these changes. I don't think.
It's a syntactic change, right? So it doesn't seem like that.
Mostly.
I actually disagree with that. I think that there's meaningful change here that is being undervalued because of the generics capture behavior is different.
Say more.
Currently, the current implementation does not allow you to capture generics in scope automatically, right? But this one would. And it also allows you to have multiple nested invocation uses of infiltrate, right? Which is a different thing, and it desugars to multiple existential types underneath, right?
Actually, it doesn't allow that.
What do you mean it doesn't?
This is specifically disallowed in the RC text.
No, it isn't.
Yes, it is. I just read it last night. Okay, I'll go. Let's look at it. I believe it is, but I'm happy to be wrong.
It definitely wasn't in at least a previous version of the RFC.
This version, I think, said it's left for future work.
Okay.
That version that I wrote. But, like I said. I guess I should have clicked on the render.
Oh, it seems like the RC says both things. I think there was one section that should have been removed but wasn't. I will ask Parker to fix that.
It says the following are forbidden. I didn't read it. I just read the text.
Yeah, I'm doing the same, but it says before. It says restricting compound infiltrate aliases, but before that it says that it's allowed. So it's saying two contradictory things. I will.
Okay. So
ask Parker to fix that.
Okay. In that case, if that's where, if that's not correct, then I agree. It is like not just a syntactic change, but a fairly stronger change. I didn't quite understand your point about capturing things in scope central, though.
It was great.
I'm happy to write up some more examples and clarify.
Okay.
I was in the impression that the thing we're discussing right now, the RFC, was indeed solely about settling syntax and not about.
It is about settling syntax, but the two different syntaxes allow you to express different actual behaviors.
But then that is an expressiveness concern.
Yes.
It actually doesn't because I mean you can
Right.
inference behavior
It is
works.
possible. It's possible to express all of the things either way. Neither of them allows you to do a thing that wouldn't be expressible under the other, but one of them would require you to write multiple other. If you wrote the explicit existential type syntax today on Nightly, you would have to use multiple existential types, and some of them would have to have generic parameters that they don't have today.
Sure, but that seems mostly like a recursive expansion and lowering thing that is mostly sugar.
It's not. I think I'll write up some examples on the RFC thread to clarify this, but it's not as trivial as you would think. Because when you're declaring it, for example, inside of a trait, it needs to capture the self type and other generic parameters in scope in the trait, but you can't actually declare the existential type as a trait, part of the trait, so you have to declare it outside and then just pass in all of those parameters.
Sure.
It is different. Like, it's not hugely different, but they're real expressiveness differences in terms of writing it in one invocation versus multiple and how the user interacts with it, right?
You're saying something like a situation like this.
Yeah, and then also, sorry, maybe I'm not looking at the right. Yes, so there's that. There's also that allows you to capture the self type. So if you move it out into a separate existential type, say if you had multiple impl traits, then you'd have to pass around the self type as well as any type parameters in scope. It's also allowing you to have impl trait that's not top level in an associated type, which isn't currently possible in the syntax without declaring it outside of the trait impl.
All right, I think we probably need to move on, but I feel like we do owe Varker, this has been stalled for a while, and we need to come up with.
I do think that it's a good idea to go and implement this before we merge the RFC. But maybe Varker doesn't want to do that.
Might be a non-trivial network, but yeah, that is one possible way. One avenue forward. But it seems like both should do some thinking, but we should also, if we. All right, I'm gonna think. I feel like it wouldn't hurt us to. I think Boat's original concern about the teaching and so on, or the sort of mental model that is here. I don't know what I'm saying.
I think that's still applicable. Is that what you're saying?
Well, it's
that's
still nice. I sort of fundamentally feel like people are going to want to write impl trait anywhere that they can, and we should work out what all the semantics of where it can work are, and work on the teaching separately. I mean, that's what they're going to want to write, whatever we give them. But I still think was an important, insightful point, and I'm kind of pondering it in the back of my mind. But, I don't know. I'm basically feeling like I'm not satisfied that we have a clear plan forward, but I also don't have an exact answer at the moment.
Do we think we can say that if you want to implement this on Nightly, go ahead?
I think we can certainly. Well, yeah, we could say that.
Okay. Can someone write that comment, please?
It's worth noting that is quite a bit of work if we just wind up throwing it away. So it's
I sort of agree with that too. I don't know if anyone will want to.
And then someone's going to review it, and it's going to be the whole question of there's a reason we made the RFC process in the first place, to avoid exactly that kind of.
Right? Yeah. So maybe we shouldn't say that.
Yeah, and that's also increasing the emotional and social investment in that particular
Right. I was going to say it's going further down the road.
Yeah. Okay. Perhaps not then. Someone should leave a comment in some form today, I think.
I will leave a comment today. And I will summarize that we talked about it. And I will
So the Rust call thingy, Taylor will leave a comment to clear up the confusion. I don't think we need to discuss it here. Moving on, we have a PR from Petroshenko to allow CFG and CFG attributes on generic parameters. We already allow attributes on generic parameters, but not CFG specifically because of a bug that we had to hotfix and then we forgot to implement it. And I have FCP this, it should be like very trivial. And review it and stuff.
The question is, does anyone, technically it's a language change, does anyone feel object or feel we need an FCP? It seems like a pretty obvious bug to me that
it's already in FCP.
Okay, then everybody check their boxes or don't. I'm checking mine right now, you can see it.
Okay, I will unnominate this.
So the next one was this closure. So we have an existing RFC that allows us to convert closures to to function pointers, but it doesn't coerce to unsafe function pointers or those with an ABI. The latter in particular might be useful from a writing against C callbacks point of view.
Wait, we have an existing RFC. Which one?
Well, we had an RFC that allowed us to do this closure to raw to function pointer coercion in the very first place. Is that right? I don't recall what the RFC said about these cases. Maybe it just left them for future work, or maybe they were explicitly disallowed. Someone wrote a PR that kind of implements it, and the question was, what should we do? Should we ask for an RFC? Should we land it with a feature gate?
For what it's worth, I already left a comment on the issue.
What did your comment say?
Oh, it's saying that I thought that there were some unclear design points and that this should get pulled out into a short RFC.
Yeah, I don't think you can actually have this case of a closure that's called from two different places because of the current design.
I would be...
I'm sorry, Nico, can you clarify that?
Because we're doing the coercion based on the expected type that's propagated down, that basically means we know that it's being assigned to a location that has the type extern CFN. So there's no alias with another ABI.
Right, but it could be assigned to that location and then also assigned to another location because it's a function pointer, so it's copy, right?
Yeah, but then the type, but if it's assigned from, like, you could write code like this, which I think is what you're saying. But now the type is extern CFN, so that this must be an extern CFN as well, right?
No, I'm saying you put nothing on that top line, and then you assign some value of a struct that is of type extern CFN, and then you also call the
like this.
The
like this would be an error. Basically, what I'm saying is this closure expression itself, I think, has to have the type. The way we do these coercions has to have a type. The coercion has to be known at that exact spot. So the type of we coerce the actual R value. Like it never gets. There's no alias to it.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
However, I would say that in general, I think we could. It's kind of a side comment, but I think we could be more liberal about ABIs. And basically, whenever you coerce from the zero size type that represents a function to a function pointer, we presently require it to have the same ABI as you wrote, but we don't need to have that requirement. We could make wrappers. But
right.
We would then you would be saying there's a unique function pointer per function per ABI.
Well, because we already have you can already do this with function items, right? Where you can pass the same like function item name into multiple things that expect like a function pointer or an unsafe function pointer or something like that, right? And it'll coerce differently in each location. In that case, it's a different it's sort of a different value expression or place. I don't know what we're. It's an R value, whatever those things are.
I could be wrong about where the coercion takes place, but that's my memory.
Okay.
Would be good to check. Yes.
It seems like a good thing to talk about.
Yeah. In any case, the real question at hand is how come. I think we want at least a stabilization period. We don't want to go insta-stable.
So how do you feel about merging this with a feature gate on nightly and then concurrently doing an RFC, or like after the PR is merged or whatever.
I feel okay with an RFC if somebody wants to drive it forward. Maybe this wants to be part of the FFI.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, I feel like this is actually like, given my opposition, seeming opposition to it, this is actually a thing that I would use quite frequently, and so I would be interested in following up with this.
Okay, and I would be happy to see it land and have a.
Okay, I will assign Taylor to the PR as well.
Okay, great, thank you.
And
I think the bigger question there was my improper C types concern, because that would be a concern for my usages of it. But
yeah, I think that's
I would want that working.
That's an interesting stable.
So Taylor, could you write a comment from us and like ask for an RFC and ask for feature gating in the PR itself? And
sure, you just want me to comment additionally in response to what I already said, noting that we discussed it in the LangTeam meeting.
Yeah.
Okay, I will do that. Thank you.
Thanks. 13 minutes. Crunch time.
There was a PR. Want to cover this one?
We have implement termination for optional units. And it seems that Scott doesn't think this is a good idea and Taylor doesn't think this is a good idea because, well, I think it is somewhat ambiguous what the semantics of some and none are. Maybe y'all can say what you think.
So this allows you to write function main arrow option, and it gives currently an error code, a return code of 1 in the case of none. Yeah. I personally don't feel a strong desire either way, but I don't know what I would expect in terms of error codes. I probably just wouldn't.
Yeah, I mean, I almost kind of feel like less strongly about this because like exactly the reason I feel this way is just why I would never type this.
Right. If I were typing it, just expect debug output. Like it's just a quick program that I don't care what it does.
So I think the main use case for this, for those who haven't read this in depth, is that you would want to use it for doc comments and doc tests, but probably not elsewhere.
So that's a pretty compelling use case, but except for the fact that I don't know what an error, like it's not obvious at all to me that none constitutes an error. But I guess it's like, well, then don't use it if that's not semantics you want or something.
I think that we should.
Wait, hold on. Why wouldn't none be an error if question mark treats none like an error, right? Or am I misremembering that?
Sure,
I mean,
but
question mark treats none like don't keep going.
Yeah, it treats it. It treats it like like return none as the output. I don't think
it's reasonable to say though that like, the point of the test is that the test went all the way through. Like if you wanted to check for none, you would write assert is none. But when you're writing a test and you use question mark, that's like the same applies to error. You can write tests that look for error results.
I guess my thoughts here is that it's not clear to me that question mark and determination are directly linked in that way.
I wonder if this says that doc test one. I don't know. I find that pretty compelling actually. It sort of changed my opinion. I went from weak opposed to weak approve. I hadn't noticed.
I think in terms of determining what the error, what the none should, what status code it should report, I think we should let the libs team decide that. Because when we did this with result and we decided to use the debug output, that was ultimately like users seemed to think that was the wrong mistake. And I think that kind of happened because we decided when maybe it's more of a libs issue and maybe libs' experience would be more relevant here.
I don't feel strongly either way. I'm happy.
I mean, I think that, yeah, I mean, I guess I would have more opposition to this if the return code was anything other than the one that seemed obvious to me. But But I mean, mostly I feel like this is just a thing I wouldn't use, and it seems weird to have it. It seems surprising in a way that, like,
I mean, the test case is, that's the main one for me. But I feel like
Yeah.
that is pretty reasonable. And if you write
Yeah.
question mark in a test, I think you mean for it to succeed, or else you would assert the opposite. So, I'm thumbs up with, I'm happy. If we want to hand the hot potato to libs and say they get to make the final call, that works for me.
Right.
I will check my box if somebody FCPs, but otherwise I'm not going to start FCP, and I don't really like it.
Yeah, I think we can pass this. So I think a reasonable conclusion here is that we pass this to the libs team. We keep lang on the label the lang label on the PR, and if libs want to FCP in either way, we can just follow on.
One thing I would note is that Scott seemed mildly opposed, and he's not here, so I prefer to give him a chance to express his opinion before we do anything.
I think Scott can do it with a concern.
Yeah, I agree. I'm just saying that's a good reason to stay on.
Yes. Okay. I think Nico will leave a comment about this.
Yes, sure.
Thank you.
I'll note that it's me.
So we are skipping type ID because it's not relevant right now. So moving on to, I would actually prefer to talk about the slice thingy for const generics.
What's the slice thingy of this?
The slice patterns.
This?
No, in denominated RFCs. The first two.
Go ahead then.
So does anyone object?
I feel these are not urgent.
Okay. So we had an RC a while back about finalizing the syntax for slice patterns with sub-slices, and which Petroshenko wrote, and then not much has happened, but they made some adjustments to the RFC, not semantic changes, but basically making it more detailed. And then they also made so there was a bit of a debate about whether ... should be a pattern syntactically, but not semantically. And they also made a follow-up RFC where ... becomes a pattern syntactically. So from my point of view, I feel we should merge both of them. And then they can be like implemented together because it seems nice to do them apart.
Can you summarize? This thing has been going on for 100 years. Do you have like a comment at the end that kind of summarizes the final state? I remember I wrote one at one point.
So just looking at the summary in the RC itself, basically you can write a slice pattern that is like, first we have an element like X, comma Y, and then the intersection pattern, ampersand, and then ... And that would bind a subarray.
The intersection pattern, this is the @ thing?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then if you don't want to use @, then you can just use ...
So you could write something like this. Pattern.
It's a binding to the left. It's not an actual intersection pattern. I just fancy thinking about it that way. So it's like ident or ref ident or
Ref. Sorry, I meant slice. This would be a slice in other words.
Right, and you can also write
yes, okay. And then there's a companion RFC to make ... sort of usable in more contexts, like for example.
It basically turns some syntactic errors into semantic errors, and I think that's a good idea because it simplifies the grammar and makes for better macros and diagnostics as well. So I think we should do that.
Yeah, I'm in favor of these things. I would approve an FCP request.
Cool. What do y'all think?
Seems fine with me.
All right, I will make an FCP later today.
All right. 3 minutes. I think we can probably. Is there anything that's super small?
Well, do you want to talk about const generics or MLF?
Is there? I don't feel like there's probably not adequate time, but maybe. I don't know what. Taylor, did you want to? Who was that who nominated this?
I did.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I mean, I did want to talk about it, but we're running close on time, so we could let people go if they want. But
I say let's leave it for next week.
that sounds good to me. I think it would be better when we're feeling rough.
Next week for the focus part. What were we going to talk about? We could talk about
infiltrate discussion.
I had that written down as a possibility. I think Boats had mentioned async await as another thing we might discuss.
Right. For my part, I haven't felt super well these last days, so I haven't been able to do anything about the tests, and I will try to get on top of that. But,
all right. Why don't we discuss it a bit? I could be happy with either of those or other things.
Yeah, there's probably.
So just FYI, Josh has been traveling a lot, which is why I keep pushing this back. But I think he's happy with this date. We don't have a lot scheduled past then.
Should we save the infiltrate discussion for when Boats has give Boats enough time to be able to talk about it?
So
Possibly.
I think for a single week, I've written a stabilization report. I'm gonna email it all to you, a gist version of it. I don't think it doesn't have his links to previous discussions that need to be added. However, I was going to do that and post it today, but then this situation involving send has occurred. And so I think depending on how that conversation is going, either we should talk about that or we should talk about, or next Thursday I will post a stabilization and we can talk about whatever other blockers people have. So I think we should talk about async await next week.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a good idea to check in on the send discussion depending on where it is, but I don't know if those of you who didn't see it already, there's a thread where we're discussing
what's the impact? So what's the impact on stable parts because we're not stabilizing it for traits?
I think that the feeling was that because it might change the syntax for traits, we wouldn't want to have a syntax for traits that was different than the syntax we used in free functions. And so we might want to adopt something different for free functions, which are part of what we're stabilizing, right?
Yeah, that we might want to apply the additional send bound to all async FN.
Right.
Want to apply for traits.
We might want to have some. All right, I have to run now, so hard to stop today.
So yeah,
I want to have more discussion about that before the meeting.
I think it would be a good idea to discuss this on the next line team meeting before posting any reports.
Right.
I think people with thoughts about this should also make sure to participate in the internals thread because
it's pretty active right now.
I think that we should be really active on this, and possibly it will. It seems likely this is what we're going to talk about. The other alternative is that before then it becomes obvious that we're not going to do this, in which case I will just post a stabilization report, and then that's what we'll talk about.
All right. So
I mean, so it's for my part, it's mainly about test, making sure that everything is okay before we amp up the the excitement for 1.337 because I'm not sure that I feel ready for 1.37 at the moment. We need to think about that.
Maybe we can, if you're busy, I think having a good suite of tests is a great idea. Maybe that's something that we can discuss with the Zulip to maybe Taylor help with elaborating those.
I will try to do my best to write a test, but yeah.
Yep. I'm also still working on this lifetime stuff, but distracted by the fact that we have 10 gazillion regressions at the moment.
Right. Thanks, everybody.
All right. See y'all later. Yep.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.